Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating and, frankly, heavily misunderstood area of tort law. We're talking about negligence, we're talking about money, and we're looking at exactly how the law draws some very strict boundaries around our financial mistakes.
Let's kick things off with a super relatable, everyday question. If someone messes up, they act completely carelessly, and as a direct result, you end up losing a ton of money. They should have to pay you back, right? I mean, it just feels like basic justice. It feels fair.
Well, actually, not always. We kind of need to shatter that assumption right out of the gate. You see, tort law isn't just this giant ATM for compensating victims. It's actually just as concerned with setting limits. Courts are constantly having to make these really tough calls about where legal responsibility starts and, maybe more importantly, where it absolutely has to end.
Section 1. The Floodgates Argument. Okay, let's dive into this. To understand why courts are so incredibly strict about drawing these lines, we have to talk about the ripple effect, the terrifying, unpredictable ripple effect of financial loss in our modern world. So, imagine this scenario. A contractor is digging in a busy city center and, whoops, they carelessly slice right through a major underground power cable. The immediate physical result? Pretty simple, the block goes dark. But the financial ripple effect? That spreads like wildfire. A local cafe instantly loses its entire lunchtime rush because the ovens are dead. A hairdresser down the street has to cancel an entire afternoon of bookings. Deliveries are snarled up across the whole city. A student sitting in their apartment suddenly can't finish a paid online gig. Literally hundreds of people are losing money. But here's the kicker. None of their actual physical property was damaged, and nobody got physically hurt. If every single one of those people could turn around and sue that one careless contractor, the liability would be absolutely unimaginable. We're talking about an unpredictable, limitless wave of lawsuits.
And that brings us to a really crucial legal concept, pure economic loss. The law defines this as financial harm resulting from negligence, but, and this is key, without any accompanying personal injury or damage to property. Now, a quick heads up here. The word pure doesn't mean the loss is minor or fake. I mean, that cafe and that hairdresser, they really lost real money. It's called pure simply because the loss is entirely financial. It is completely isolated from any physical harm. This brilliantly illustrates the dividing line we're dealing with. Think about a negligent driver who crashes into a taxi. The cost to repair the crushed bumper. That's property damage. Easy. Now, if the taxi driver loses a week of earnings while the car is stuck in the repair shop, that is what we call consequential economic loss. It is anchored directly to the physical damage of the car, and yeah, generally they can recover that money. But pure economic loss? That stands entirely on its own. There is no physical anchor, which makes it incredibly difficult to claim.
Section 2. Careless Acts. So, when we look at physical actions, things people actually do that cause financial ruin, I have to deliver some pretty harsh truth. The general rule is that pure economic loss caused by a negligent act is generally not recoverable. Seriously, it doesn't matter if the defendant was wildly, unbelievably careless. It doesn't even matter if your financial loss was a totally foreseeable result of their stupidity. If you don't have that physical damage to anchor your claim, you're probably out of luck. To see exactly how courts enforce this harsh line, let's look at a classic, the 1973 case, Spartan Steel versus Martin. The defendants here were contractors who negligently severed an electricity cable, causing a massive power cut at the claimant's steel factory. Now, when the lights went out, the factory was right in the middle of processing a huge batch of molten metal. They ended up suffering 3 distinct types of financial loss, and the court analyzed every single one. First, the molten metal sitting in the furnace was completely ruined. That is physical property damage. So the court said, yep, that loss is recoverable. Second, they lost the profit they would have made on that specific batch of ruined metal. That's consequential economic loss, tied right to the physical damage. So, recoverable again. But then we hit the third loss. The factory claimed they lost even more profits because they couldn't produce new metal during the hours the power remained off. The court looked at that and gave a hard no. That third loss was purely financial, totally disconnected from the physically damaged metal. It was pure economic loss and therefore not recoverable.
And honestly, the law gets even stricter. Take the 1966 case of Weller versus Foot and Mouth Disease Research Institute. A virus escapes from a research lab, it infects local cattle, and boom, the regional livestock markets are completely shut down. The claimants in this case were auctioneers. They lost a massive amount of money because they couldn't run their auctions. But because they didn't actually own the infected cattle, the farmers did, the auctioneer's claim completely failed. This is what we call relational economic loss. Losing money just because someone else's property gets damaged? That doesn't count either. So what does this all mean? It brings us to a really fundamental public policy question.
how far should negligence liability extend? Courts are forced to draw these incredibly strict and, sometimes really harsh lines simply because they have to keep society functioning.
The whole topic really turns on that exact contrast. Careless acts, as we've just seen, face severe restrictions when it comes to pure financial loss. But careless words? Well, that is an entirely different story. By shifting our focus from the things people do to the things people say, the law actually opens up a gateway to liability. Though, as you'll see, it's under highly controlled circumstances.
Section 3. Careless words. Let's move to the crucial exception where pure economic loss actually can be recovered. It's called negligent misstatement. This happens when an incorrect statement is made carelessly, and it ends up causing a financial loss. But, and this is a huge but, there is a massive caveat. This only works if there is a special relationship between the person doing the speaking and the person doing the listening. You see, words can travel just as fast, if not faster, than those ripples from a power cut. So the law uses a very strict checklist, these control mechanisms, to prevent an absolute avalanche of lawsuits. If you want to win a claim here, step 1, there must be a special relationship, and that usually involves some kind of expertise. Step 2, the defendant must have actively assumed responsibility. And step 3, the claimant must have reasonably relied on that statement to make their financial move. The absolute foundational case that blew the doors open for this exception is Headley-Byrne versus Heller from 1964. Here's the setup. Advertising agents asked a bank for a credit reference on a company they were about to do a lot of business with. The bank hands over a highly favorable credit reference. The agents rely on it, they go ahead, the company eventually goes belly up, and the agents lose a fortune. The House of Lords looked at this situation and made a massive ruling. They recognized that yes, a duty of care can arise for pure economic loss resulting from a statement. It was a real game changer. But there's a twist. On these specific facts, the bank had actually slapped a header on the reference stating, "without responsibility." And that one simple disclaimer, it slammed the door right back shut and blocked liability entirely. So, if you're playing the role of the judge here, one of the most absolutely vital questions you have to ask when evaluating careless words is this. Who exactly was the statement for? The context, the setting, and the intended audience of a statement, they matter immensely. The landmark 1990 case of Caparo versus Dickman hits the nail on the head for this exact point. The defendants were auditors who had prepared the annual accounts for a company. A claimant got a hold of those accounts and used them to decide to buy up shares and launch a massive takeover bid. Well, it turned out the accounts were negligently prepared. The company was actually in terrible financial health. The claimant lost a ton of money and immediately sued the auditors. But the claim failed. Why? The court said those accounts were prepared specifically for the existing shareholders as a collective body, not for some individual outside investor looking to make a specific takeover move. The rule is clear. A statement must be made to a known person for a known purpose to trigger liability.
Now, what's really fascinating here is that these rules don't just apply to fancy professionals in suits doing formal corporate audits. Look at Chaudhry versus Probucker from 1989. A guy with a lot of car knowledge informally advised a friend to buy a specific second-hand car. Turns out it was an absolute wreck that had been in a major accident. Even though this was just friendly, totally informal advice between mates, the court actually found liability. Why? Because she reasonably relied on his known expertise. Or take Esso Petroleum in 1976. That case proved that even an inaccurate forecast or an expert estimate can create liability, provided it's given by someone with expertise and the reliance on it makes logical sense.
Section 4. Drawing the boundary.
All right, let's zoom out from the specific case law for a second. Tort law, as we're seeing, isn't just about handing out cash to a victim. It is a constant, massive public policy balancing act. On one side of the scale, you have the claimant's totally legitimate interest in getting compensation when someone else's carelessness completely ruins them financially. But on the other side, the defendant needs predictable, rational limits to their responsibility. And above all of that, society itself has a massive interest in unburdened economic activity. If we suddenly allowed endless lawsuits for every indirect financial consequence, businesses would freeze up. They become overly defensive, completely overinsured, and totally paralyzed by the fear of these remote risks.
And that brings us right back to summarize the core dichotomy of this entire explainer. Careless acts, they are strictly limited by the courts because they create widespread, completely unpredictable financial ripples. Careless statements, on the other hand, are cautiously allowed to trigger liability, but only because they involve a much narrower, much more controllable relationship between the person speaking and the person relying on those words.
So as you consider how all these rules might apply to the businesses and the interactions in your own day-to-day life, it leaves us with a pretty compelling final thought. When someone's mistake costs you money, you really have to ask yourself, in the grand scheme of negligence, is the law ultimately there to protect you as a victim, or is its real job to protect society as a whole from an endless flood of lawsuits? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking the big questions, and I'll catch you next time.